essentially in some cases, I think that structure can give the illusion of precision in the training intervention that isn't actually there.
I think this is a really interesting discussion because we coach people virtually these days, and that lends itself quite well to putting numbers in cells such that you are, like, that is one of the main deliverables. Whereas something that I've definitely changed over the last 5, 6, 7 years is a much more, like, a greater focus on the skill of training.
We kind of got into this discussion of just like super high level like training discussion in terms of like the balance between structure and flexibility, or rigidity and flexibility. And I think I've had a lot of different views on this the more that I've had what I would consider maybe non-standard coaching clients. So, you know, I've coached a lot of people over the years. The majority of them were what you would consider like probably like intermediate lifters, you know, looking to really break that next echelon of like really getting to that advanced level and trying to really reach the peak of their, you know, their genetic potential kind of thing. But mostly in that intermediate realm. I think you run into areas where it requires pretty come to Jesus kind of conversations on the way that you're making decisions when you get to one of two areas. One, when somebody's extremely advanced and they've hit a plateau. That's kind of the first example is like, all right, what are my principles to help us continue to make progress when I'm also facing the dragon of the linear log curve of adaptation, where we're reaching the point where the expectations may not be there's much more room to go kind of thing. That's kind of the first case.
Are you willing to train your tail off to put 5 to 10 kilos on your total this year?
Exactly. That's like case A. The other case, and this is the case that I've had a lot of experience with more recently, is maybe someone who isn't necessarily at that point of their genetic potential, but the external constraints that they're dealing with effectively get them to a similar position. So these are people with extremely chronic injuries. These are people with very limited time to train, but still want to make progress. These are people with other types of health disorders and things like that kind of conflict with their goals. And effectively, you have an external constraint situation that make the person, their advancement accelerate essentially, so that progress is much harder to come by. And I've had a few of these situations recently, whether they be chronic injuries, like I said, whether it be someone with time availability issues, a couple of very interesting like health related things as well. And I've come to kind of the position that structure and things like that can be both a extreme positive thing in a lot of cases, and I think that that can be something that gets a lot of people to the next level, is having some degree of structure, some degree of predictability to their training. But I also think there comes a point where that can be something that effectively works against you. So I'll paint this as a kind of an example. So we're kind of bred as powerlifters to be very type A, very analytical, very structured with your training. You know exactly the weights you're going to hit on week 2, week 3, week 4. You have your progressions planned out. A lot of these things are like very, very, penciled in, for lack of a better word. Like the
detail-oriented.
Yeah, detail-oriented. The lines around the blocks are very, very clear. However, obviously, the case for auto-regulation itself has been made abundantly clear. I'd say almost all powerlifters or people in kind of our niche are training with RP, RAR, and they're integrating some of these autoregulatory strategies to account for fluctuations in their life stress and things like that may affect your day-to-day performance. However, I think I've grown to appreciate that is really, and we've kind of made the analogy between like the coarse and the fine dial a couple times, and I've grown to appreciate that I really think that is just the fine dial, and in certain scenarios it's just not sufficient. And by having this kind of training culture that breeds this very detail-oriented, analytical, this is the plan kind of mindset, I think it removes your, for lack of a better term, like just inherent intuition on sometimes what the correct training decision is. And obviously, this is where, the balance of structure and flexibility is that main thing. Someone who's very early on in their training career, they're not going to know what effective flexibility looks like. They're not going to know how to make those decisions in a intelligent way. But as I've gained, or as I've grown to appreciate how training is probably operating more on these kind of really high level principles, and there are no super right or wrong, like individual decisions on like I did well with safety squat bar, I can't do high bar. Those kind of things. I've kind of abandoned a lot of those beliefs. I've grown just to appreciate how much that flexibility can be leveraged to your advantage in a lot of cases. So kind of coming back to a practical example is like you have like a power lifter who is one of these more chronic injury individuals. And sometimes there are just fluctuations in your life, training stress, what have you. I don't know the exact combination of factors, but I believe it to be the best decision to strongly deviate for whatever is planned for that day. And that's not just changing the training loads. And I think people talk about that.
It's more than just like, yeah, of course I'm changing based on the RP7 prescription.
Yeah.
You're talking about something bigger than just, load autoregulation that most powerlifters
exactly. And I think if you were to talk to lifters from like 50 years ago, like it's kind of just the whole listen to your body thing, but it's something that I haven't super well like formalized into like a process on how to go about it. But I just think it's just
there's a skill for sure.
Yeah. And it's just an overwhelming thought that I had that like, and the example I've thought about to kind of try to articulate it a little bit and poke holes in it as you see fit, but just I've been trying to figure out a way to articulate it in a better way. It's kind of like calorie intake is kind of the thing that I've used as like an example. A lot of us kind of just assume if I eat the same mean calorie intake every day, that will effectively allow me to get to my nutrition goals, which I don't think is a bad assumption.
So if your target is 2,800 calories.
Eat 2,800 calories every single day. Do that for a month. You're probably going to have the net result in your body weight in whatever direction you want that to be.
Sure.
Great. Check the box. Awesome. However, every individual day, obviously, our energy expenditure is not directly meeting up with that. The degree to which that fluctuates, I'm not really using for this example, but just bear in mind for the example that like your energy expenditure is not directly 2,800 every single day. So every single eighth day that you eat 2,800 calories, some days you're in a mild surplus, some days you're in a mild deficit or what have you.
Or you're changing the magnitude of the surplus.
Exactly. Yeah, sorry, that's actually a better example. You're either up or over your target. Yeah. And on net, you're where you want to be. But if you zoom in on any individual day, you're actually not hitting the quote-unquote target accurately. And it may be that the calorie needs of those individual days are actually different based on what's occurring in that individual day. And so when you put this into the context of training, I view that pretty similarly at this point, is that like we have structure and we have all these systems in place because the kind of the normal level of training stress we want to deal with to get the results that we want is something we can utilize. But in very extreme cases, whether that be super advancement or some of these non-standard training scenarios, I think the fact that you're kind of overdoing it, underdoing it in any individual session can kind of have some ramifications. And then further extrapolating the analogy, like macronutrient intake, I think a lot of people are willing to be flexible with their proteins, carbs, and fats a little bit day to day. Obviously, they have some targets, but they're, particularly carbs and fat, I think there's a little bit of more willingness to be flexible with those things. But for training, we're not willing to do the same thing. We're not willing to be flexible with our rep ranges. We're not willing to be flexible with our exercise selection. And so I don't really have a super neat takeaway from this other than I've just grown to appreciate that we put ourselves in a box in a lot of cases with respect to training and training prescriptions and make things pretty nice and neat and try to abide to them perfectly in all scenarios with minor adjustments, but potentially not as much adjustments as we should make. For some people, that level of structure ends up being a massive net positive. And I think that's probably the vast majority of people. Having a training program can help you get to the gym, help you execute it effectively, help you get all the principles that we know are based on effective training, helps you adhere to all those things. But in some cases, I think that the kind of the line that I wrote down is that essentially in some cases, I think that structure can give the illusion of precision in the training intervention that isn't actually there. And so I don't know if that makes sense or any follow-up.
I have so many thoughts. I think this is a really interesting discussion because we coach people virtually these days. And I think a lot of people listening to this have a virtual coach or coach people virtually or both. And that lends itself quite well to putting numbers in cells such that you are like, that is one of the main deliverables. Whereas something that I've definitely changed over the last 5, 6, 7 years is a much more like a greater focus on the skill of training. So you mentioned someone that is, quite advanced in terms of training, or they have some other constraint, whether it's an injury constraint or a time constraint, or they're, just really deep into their training career. So one of the guys, this is separate from the guy where I was talking about just redistributing the training stress. The other guy that's in meet prep, he's 49. And hey, quick little plug. He started on some of our lower cost programming products, and he got started in his mid 40s. I think he was probably 46 when he started with DDS. Now he's 49. He has put on like 200 pounds on his total, and he's been training his whole adult life, and he's now hitting numbers raw that he hit in reps when he was like in his 30s. So he's put almost 100 pounds on his squat, which is crazy. So shout out to him. But anyway, looking at his program, it's a lot more note heavy than it used to be. So like, it's, hey, instead of just like, we're going to hit a single at RP today, it's, hey, we're going to hit a single. Here's a cap in terms of load or RPE, but I want you to auto-regulate quite a bit based on the readiness based on just general readiness. And then there are clear days that are priority where we want to push, even if you don't feel quite as ready for it. And what I often say to clients is like, the structure is there to keep you honest and to push you, right? Because if you have a program that says, hey, after you do your top set and 2 back offs, you got to do your stiff leg deadlifts for 3 sets. Whereas you might not otherwise do that if you're just really, really being flowy with it. So the structure kind of keeps you honest. The program kind of keeps you honest. But I also say, don't be a prisoner to the program. Yep. I say that all the time because if you're a prisoner to the program and you don't leave any room for training skill, you're almost certainly not actually being as precise as you think. Exactly. So in the case of nutrition, I don't think you're using the example of nutrition to say that, oh, you should like auto-regulate your calorie intake a bunch. Because in the case of nutrition, if you're targeting a 500 calorie deficit, and some days you're in a 300 calorie deficit, and some days you're in a 700 calorie deficit, it's not that big of a deal. Exactly. There's no like huge downside to that. But in training, there is, such that if we use that analogy of a deficit, if the general target is a 500 calorie deficit, but then you're in a 1,000 calorie deficit from a training perspective, someone deep into their career 2 weeks out and, they weigh less than 200 pounds, they're putting over 500 pounds on their back, that precision does matter. Yeah. So if you don't have the like flexibility and the encouragement to use the training skill to stray from the structure, that's in a lot of ways less precision. So I think coaching is like strategically using structure and rigidity and also encouraging a straying from structure and rigidity. And I often tell folks, hey, this is the best I can put on paper. I expect you to stray from this at times. Let me know when you stray from it in your thought process, and I will give you feedback so we can continue to develop that skill.